You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey there, I'm Travis Hoyam, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing. Each weekday on Motley Fool Hidden Gems Investing, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we game plan personal finance strategies and dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights and a long-term perspective on investing and, of course, stock ideas, plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
During the heyday of spiritualism in 1873, still more than a decade before the founding of the British Society for Psychical Research and 15 years before the Fox sisters finally owned up to their rappings being a hoax, a Russian woman of aristocratic extraction named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky appeared in New York and presented herself as a medium of great powers. She was a mysterious woman. As a child, she had traveled with her family all over Russia and Central Asia. At 17 years old, she was married and taken to Armenia, but after making several attempts to escape his control, her husband, from whom she took her surname Blavatsky, allowed her to leave and rejoin her family in the Ukraine. En route, however, she slipped away from her escorts and fled to Constantinople, and thereafter traveled the world. According to her later writings, it was during this decade that she toured Egypt and the Middle East as well as Europe, making her way through Greece, Paris, and England before heading overseas to Canada, the American South, the Caribbean, then finding passage to South Asia, making her way across India, and finally ending up in Tibet. It is uncertain just how true her later tales of world travel were, though. For example, more than one biographer has pointed out how unlikely it would have been for her to have reached Tibet during the 19th century, when its borders were closed to Europeans. Moreover, the story, as we have received it, is part of a later myth that she developed, claiming to have been led in her travels by a quote-unquote mysterious Indian man named Maurya, whom she identified as one of several, quote, masters of ancient wisdom, end quote, clairvoyant telepaths and guardians of esoteric knowledge, from which she would later claim to have received all her powers and hidden truths. At the time of her first appearance in New York, while she was staying at a women's boarding house and earning a low wage through sewing work, she did tell a news reporter, who only happened to interview her because she had been tasked, quote, to write an article upon a Russian subject, end quote, that she had recently come from Tibet, mentioning nothing just yet of her supposed tutelage at the feet of the masters. Clearly, though, she did already have in mind that this was some significant accomplishment to brag about. I remember perfectly well her saying with an air of exultation, "I have been in Tibet," her interviewer later recalled. Why she should think that a great matter more remarkable than any other of the travels in Egypt, India, and other countries she told me about, I could not make out. But she said it with special emphasis and animation, end quote. It certainly sounds like she was already mythologizing herself. Soon after her arrival in New York, she inherited her father's fortune, installed herself in a posh hotel, and began dabbling in spiritualism. She did not enter the field of mediumship directly, though. Like many another medium, she found her calling after attending the seances of others. Having read some articles exclaiming the authenticity of certain seance phenomena by journalist Henry Steele Olcott, and hearing that he was in Vermont attending the seances of the Eddy brothers, she made her way there and introduced herself. She said she feared Olcott might want to write about her in his newspaper, even though she'd given him no reason to do so, and he'd not expressed any interest in making her his subject. Clearly, Blavatsky was fishing for attention, and she continued to do so during the Eddy brothers' seance. These farm boys put on a rather showy materialization or manifestation seance, raising a blanket in front of a closet, making it look as though musical instruments were floating above it and playing themselves, sticking a phantom hand through a gap in the blanket to write on a slate, and throughout each performance, quote-unquote, manifesting spirits by moving the blanket aside to briefly reveal one of the brothers dressed in costume. When Blavatsky was in attendance, however, she managed to make herself the star of the show, claiming that the apparition was the spirit of her sister's servant, or a merchant, a nurse, a soldier she knew by name. Blavatsky effectively hijacked the Eddy brothers' seances and made herself the medium simply by naming the specters they paraded before the audience. In the following months and years, as she developed her own skills as a medium and accompanied Alcott on his investigations of other mediums, she also slowly developed an occult belief system and made of Alcott her first convert. Influenced by the quasi-religious secret societies so popular in the day, like Freemasons, she and Alcott started their own, the Brotherhood of the Luxor, which eventually evolved to become the Theosophical Society, the word theosophy combining the Greek words for God and wisdom. The influence of Tibetan culture on her thought and lifestyle was apparent. She and Alcott moved into an apartment together, which they decorated like a museum of esoterica and called the Lamasery. It was there that she began writing Isis Unveiled, the work that laid out her grand unifying theory of nearly everything. She took some ideas from Allan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism, a branch of spiritualism that emphasized the soul's reincarnation, as well as some notions from the Arabic Unitarian Druze faith, which she had become familiar with during her Middle Eastern travels, for she came to emphasize that all religions derived from one universal, quote-unquote, ancient wisdom, or quote-unquote, secret doctrine. The work of British occult sci-fi writer Edward Bulwer-Lytton, whose book The Coming Race, about a hidden master race wielding the mysterious energy Vril, had so influenced Nazi occultism as well as later ufology, as discussed in my recent episode on the myth of Nazi supertechnology, also greatly influenced Blavatsky. Her mother had actually translated Bulwer-Lytton's writings into Russian, so she knew his work from a young age. Indeed, her entire notion of quote-unquote masters seems owed to Bulwer-Lytton's novel Zanoni, about an immortal Rosicrucian initiate with access to ancient wisdom. And she would claim that such wisdom was accessed by the masters through the ether, that pseudoscientific all-encompassing quintessence, which she compared to Vril. To Blavatsky, the fantasy writings of Edward Bulwer-Lytton had some basis in truth. Or to put it another way, her beliefs were based on fiction. She was driven to syncretize and unify, attempting to marry the notions of Vril and ether with the pseudoscientific animal magnetism of mesmerism, and to reconcile the seemingly contradictory scientific discovery of evolution by natural selection, which some saw as evidence of absolute materialism and disproof of the existence of a soul, with spiritualism's supposed proofs of the existence of human spirits. The result, in Isis Unveiled, was a manifesto synthesizing Eastern mystical thought, occult hermeticism, mythology, folklore, philosophy, and science. By her telling, and like many mediums before her, she claimed that something, some being, the quote-unquote lodger within her, was actually writing her works. The history of Earth extended far beyond recorded history. The ancient wisdom revealed to her that there had been 4 preceding species of mankind, or quote-unquote root races, as she called them, gradually evolving from pure spirits to our current physical condition, each of them a cycle of rebirth and inevitable cataclysm on the various lost continents of legend, Hyperborea, Lemuria, and Atlantis. The current iteration of humanity, the 5th root race, she called, quote-unquote, Aryan. And though hearing her talk about root races and Aryans, and even seeing her use of the savastika, or reverse swastika, may cause our hackles to rise and our Nazi radar to ping, it is hard to draw too meaningful a connection there. Certainly the ideas and iconography of theosophy were adapted by German occultists and specifically twisted by Ariosophists to suit their nationalist anti-Semitic racial ideology. but Blavatsky seems to have used the term Aryan in a more Indo-Iranian sense, as derived from the word's Sanskrit origins, and she embraced the svastika symbol in its ancient Indian sense. For in 1879, after publishing Isis Unveiled and seeing her Theosophical Society spread overseas, with lodges opening in England, she moved to India and opened a lodge in Bombay. Soon all her writings took on the terminology of Hinduism and Buddhism. The masters became Mahatmas, the vril-like ether became the Akash, and the ancient wisdom accessed through it became the Akashic record. Eventually, she even introduced an element of millenarianism, borrowing the messianic figure of the Maitreya from Buddhism and declaring that this quote-unquote world teacher would soon arrive to herald the end of the fifth root race and the advent of the sixth. But by the time all of this mythology had been developed, Madame Helena Blavatsky had already been quite discredited. In 1884, one of her acolytes was accused of embezzling from the organization, and she responded by leaking incriminating letters to the press. In the letters, Blavatsky gave specific instructions for how to manufacture certain manifestations during the séances in which she claimed to be contacting the Mahatmas. Blavatsky had her followers convinced that the Mahatmas sent phantom communiques, physical letters that materialized within a certain shrine or came fluttering into a room out of nowhere. And these masters even sometimes manifested in the room, supposedly through astral projection. The letters leaked to the press revealed that these manifestations were simply a dummy head on a coat hook over which was draped clothing, a common trick among mediums who claimed to materialize spirits. And more than that, they revealed that Blavatsky had secret panels in the shrine and spring-loaded mechanisms in cracks in the ceiling by which she faked the manifestation of letters from the Mahatmas that she'd written herself in a disguised hand. Soon afterward, the Society for Psychical Research dispatched Richard Hodgson to investigate, and in his detailed 1885 report on the case, Hodgson authenticated the leaked letters and confirmed the existence of the contraptions for faking manifestations. It concluded that Blavatsky was, quote, one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting imposters in history, end quote. By this time, Blavatsky's health was declining, as was belief and membership in her Theosophical Society. She left India for London, where she struggled against a schism and ended up having to start a new lodge for what she called, quote, true Theosophists, end quote. She was losing control of the strange hodgepodge religion she had founded. It was then, in 1888, that the Fox sisters confessed to faking their rappings. Blavatsky would only make it another few years, passing away in the Russian flu epidemic. Within a few more years, it was uncovered that she had plagiarized more than 2,000 passages in her book, Isis Unveiled, from 100 different sources. Within only 20 years, Madame Blavatsky had created a massive esoteric tradition, growing her followers to hundreds of lodges across the US, Great Britain, and India, with thousands upon thousands of adherents, before she was finally and authoritatively revealed to be a fraud. And yet, since that time, Theosophy has only grown. Refusing to accept the Hodgson report and suggesting that her plagiarism only proved she really was accessing the Akashic record and channeling its ancient wisdom, the followers of Blavatsky continued to defend her tirelessly. And today, the Theosophical Society boasts lodges in more than 70 countries and has grown its membership to more than 30,000. Like the Fox sisters, Blavatsky never claimed to be starting a religion, but that is certainly what she did. And also like the Fox sisters, when she was finally exposed as a fraud, it didn't much matter because her hoax had grown far bigger than herself. Too big to debunk. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I know this was the longest cold open I've ever done, but when I'm here in my trance, accessing the Akashic record, sometimes I get pulled into lengthy and digressive rabbit holes. Bear with me as I bring us back on track for Common Séance, A History of Spiritualism, Part 2, Manifestly False. Before we begin, I want to thank my newest patrons, Nicholas Pyzik, Eric Robertson-Gordon, and Emma Falk. And special thanks to Emma for recently repledging generous support at the partner tier. Support from listeners like you on Patreon is what makes it possible for me to devote as much time as I do to the podcast. I love making the show. It's fun to make, and I'm proud of what I do in it. But also recently, my academic career has faltered a bit, and my income has taken a hit. So I'm hoping to bolster listenership to this podcast and maybe bring it to a point where I can earn a little more from it so that I have a good excuse to keep devoting time to it. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my series on flat earthism, I released a minisode about the growth of flat earth belief in America. And after the first part of my series on spiritualism, I released a long minisode about Victoria Woodhull, a medium, a champion of women's rights, and the first ever female candidate for U.S. president. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. To return to the Fox sisters and their 1888 revelation of their imposture and the fabricated basis of all spiritualism. Almost immediately, Maggie Fox's confession was rejected by the true believers in mediumship. Some pointed to her alcoholism. During the 1870s, while Madame Blavatsky's star was rising, the sisters had married and moved to England, and it was during those years that both of them had developed drinking problems. In fact, their sister Leah, who had formerly exploited the two of them and had since remained active in the family business of mediumship, reportedly made some efforts to remove Kate Fox's children from her care. Believers also latched onto this report to suggest that the Fox sisters' confession had only ever been a gambit meant to hurt their sister Leah by ruining the industry of spiritualism on which she had built her livelihood. Others claimed that the Roman Catholic Church to which Maggie converted after her marriage had turned her against mediumship, convincing her that her powers had been derived from Satan and setting her on a mission to destroy the movement. None of these suggestions logically discredit their confession, though. If their alcoholism made them untrustworthy, then how could their previous claims of possessing special powers be trusted? And doing harm to the spiritualist movement would harm themselves and their own livelihood as much as it would their sisters, nor would it keep their sister from asserting that Kate was an unfit mother. In fact, it might actually help her case. As for the religious explanation, Maggie did stop her medium practices for a time after marrying and converting to Catholicism, but upon her husband's death, she had returned to it. And her confession was not that her powers were evil, but rather that they had been a fraud. Perhaps the most damning disproof of their confession came a year later, when Maggie recanted her confession and explained that she had only done it on the promise of being paid. A journalist for the New York World, whom Maggie portrayed as representing larger forces arrayed against spiritualism, had apparently promised her thousands of dollars if she confessed to a hoax. When he never paid up, Maggie said the whole thing was a lie and that she regretted the harm she had caused the movement. But how could the Fox sisters be considered trustworthy to begin with if they were willing to lie for money? Isn't that what they had confessed to doing in their seances? And didn't this merely confirm that they had no qualms about doing it? Moreover, Maggie's recantation was accompanied by an announcement that she intended to embark on a lecture tour. So even then, it seemed she was working an angle and seeking to drum up interest in her flagging career. But regardless of what rationalizations believers came up with to disbelieve the confession, the unavoidable truth was that she had given public demonstrations, proving that she could produce the wrappings on command. The only explanation that believers could really come up with for this was that she had faked those wrappings, which of course only proved she could fake wrappings, or that she had used her powers to command a spirit to make the wrappings, which is absurd. It not only defeats the entire idea of mediumship, if a medium is thought to command and force the spirits to communicate how they wish, but it is also just highly ironic, the idea that they would use their mediumship powers to convince people they had none. Both sisters tried to resume conducting seances for money, but interest in their powers had waned. Within 5 years of their confession, both sisters died in poverty. At the time of the Fox sisters' confession, the British Society for Psychical Research was undergoing something of a schism. Hodgson's report on Helena Blavatsky had divided their ranks, as some among them were themselves theosophists and believers. Then his 1887 report, mentioned in the last episode, which proved that seance participants were easily fooled and convinced by stage magician tricks, led many spiritualists to begin abandoning their ranks, dissatisfied with Hodgson's skeptical approach to investigations. Nevertheless, the SPR continued its debunking of so-called physical mediums, specifically focusing on mediums who claimed to produce actual physical effects. These had evolved from the rapping sounds of the Fox sisters and the slate writing of other mediums to include the actual manifestation of spirits, such as those the Eddy brothers faked. These frauds would evolve over the years from the appearance of accomplices in costume who could simply be seized and unmasked, to dummies on coat hangers, such as those used by Blavatsky, and even just cardboard cutouts. In 1891, English naturalist and debunker of flat earthism Alfred Russel Wallace, himself a believer in spiritualism, requested that the society investigate the rising phenomenon of spirit photography, in which photographs seemed to capture apparitions. Eleanor Sidgwick, the wife of the SPR's president, whom I spoke about in my recent episode on the Moberly Jourdain incident, as the first skeptic to really challenge those women's claims of having seen ghosts or slipped through time at Versailles, answered Wallace with a detailed paper demonstrating that these manifestations were frauds as well, produced through a variety of tricks in the darkroom, like the layering of negatives and double exposure. With each successive debunking, the SPR further alienated the very group that had originally organized them, the British National Association of Spiritualists, which had come to be called the London Spiritualist Alliance. But at the same time, they also never achieved credibility in the scientific community. As rational skeptics pointed out, they might debunk physical mediums, but they continued to be biased in favor of the existence of psychic phenomena. In 1895, they investigated the Italian medium Eusebia Palladino, and the Sidgwicks, along with Richard Hodgson and skeptic Frank Podmore, determined that all the phenomena present during her seances, table levitation and the movement of objects, was accomplished by her freeing a hand or a foot to move things, mere parlor tricks. And yet, the British Medical Journal suggested that the very act of investigating this woman, who was already widely considered a fraud, helped to legitimize her. It was the same claim we've seen before, that skeptical or scientific debunking of nonsense actually legitimizes it. The journal stated that, quote, "it would be comic if it were not deplorable," end quote, to see Palladino, quote, "surrounded by men like Professor Sidgwick, solemnly receiving her pinches and kicks, her finger skiddings, her sleight of hand with various articles of furniture, as phenomena calling for serious study," end quote. Eleanor Sidgwick protested, quote, "we have continually combated and exposed the frauds of professional mediums. and have never yet published in our proceedings any report in favor of the performances of any of them," end quote. But the British Medical Journal nevertheless suggested that they not waste their time on, quote, "jugglery and imposture," end quote, and devote themselves to real science if they wished to be taken seriously. Such criticisms of the investigations of the SPR can certainly be seen as unfair. In my view, they were doing good work in exposing frauds. My thoughts on the idea that one shouldn't dignify nonsense, even to refute or disprove it, are very clear by now, I should think. However, the further story of Richard Hodgson demonstrates that, indeed, 19th century psychical researchers were hopelessly biased in favor of the phenomena. Though they did expose many frauds, they clearly wanted to believe. In those years, Richard Hodgson came to America and joined the newly founded American Society for Psychical Research, where he would continue his investigations. His reputation by this time was that of a tireless skeptic and champion of reason. Perhaps more than anyone, he had helped to prove that all mediums were charlatans. He had gone to India and exposed Madame Blavatsky. Afterward, he had exposed the slate writing and table levitation tricks of Henry Slade, William Eglinton, and Eusebia Palladino, among others. And he'd even proven through experimentation that séance participants were routinely fooled by parlor tricks, and even embellished the phenomena of séances themselves. Nor did he limit himself to physical mediumship. He also exposed trance mediums who purported to display clairvoyance. One of these was Rosina Thompson, who appeared on occasion to be capable of coming up with correct answers to questions she should not have been able to answer. Hodgson proved that she had researched séance participants, that she had looked up information about them in reference works like Who's Who, and had, in some cases, even acquired their personal correspondence in order to fake her psychic powers. But Hodgson proved himself quite vulnerable still to the falsehoods of mediumship. Around the turn of the century, Hodgson became convinced that medium Leonora Piper, who claimed to channel the dead through automatic writing, was genuine. Despite a journalist from the Boston Globe systematically debunking things she claimed about the spirits she was supposedly channeling, Hodgson was obsessed. It was said he would stand outside her house, even during blizzards, just watching her. And in his final years, he came to believe that he had himself become a sort of medium, communicating with the spirits who surrounded Piper. For her part, Piper exploited his belief. She made predictions about his future, about a forthcoming marriage and children, none of which came true before Hodgson's death. And after his passing, she claimed to be in communication with his spirit, though she could not answer simple questions about his childhood. In the end, though Hodgson's mind seems to have been consumed by his work, he nevertheless managed one last debunking. He had left a sealed letter behind, a test stating that Piper, if her powers were genuine and she really were in contact with his spirit, would be capable of revealing its contents. Leonora Piper, however, could not. By the end of Hodgson's life, he had seen not only the survival and growth of theosophy, he'd also seen spiritualism emerge triumphant, regardless of any debunking or confession of fraud, and become institutionalized as a bona fide new religion. In addition to the hosting of private seances and exhibitions of spirit communication at lecture halls, the movement grew like other religions of its day, through camp meetings that sprang up across New England. The most popular of these was at a quaint little hamlet in western New York called Lilydale, which began as a community of freethinkers and drew spiritualists with its first mediums convention. By the 1890s, Lilydale was essentially a commune for believers in spiritualism. Some believers in the phenomena continued to reject the notion that they were a burgeoning religion, while others, who accepted the religiosity of the movement, rejected the idea of organizing. Nevertheless, by the end of the century, the movement was more and more organized and took on more and more of the trappings of religion. Groups like the National Spiritualist Association in the US and the Spiritualists' National Union in Great Britain held conventions and declared sets of principles, acknowledging not only the persistence of the human soul after death and their communication with the living, but also the existence of a creative force they recognized as God and a certainty about some eternal reward or punishment. But unlike other religious groups, they embraced the theory of evolution and reconciled it with the existence of the soul by subscribing to Alfred Russel Wallace's view of spiritual evolution. Wallace did not believe that evolution by natural selection could account for the endowment of humanity with intelligent and moral souls. But rather than the heaven and hell of traditional religion, he believed that the soul continued to evolve morally and intellectually. It was a position influenced by Blavatsky's theosophy, which envisioned an eternal progress through the ages, and this became a central principle of spiritualist belief. Eventually, some of these organizations were recognized as churches, and together formed the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, whose headquarters were located at Lilydale. But even as they grew and became institutionalized, they were denounced by the Roman Catholic Church, which viewed the practice as witchcraft and necromancy rather than simple fraud, and issued a decree in 1898 condemning it as such. Now for a brief intermission.
Amazon Health AI presents Painful Thoughts.
Why did I search the internet for answers to my cold sore problem? Now I'm stuck down a rabbit hole filled with images of alarmingly graphic sores in various stages of ooze. I can clear my search history, but I can never unsee that.
Don't go down the rabbit hole. Amazon Health AI gets you the right care, fast. Healthcare just got less painful.
Hi, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month, even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending, zero tears.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
When it's time to scale your business, it's time for Shopify. Get everything you need to grow the way you want. Like, all the way. Stack more sales with the best converting checkout on the planet. Track your cha-chings from every channel, right in one spot. And turn real-time reporting into big-time opportunities. Take your business to a whole new level. Switch to Shopify. Start your free trial today.
If you're a QuickBooks customer looking to grow without the growing pains, you need the Intuit ERP, the AI native ERP that upgrades right from QuickBooks. Learn more at intuit.com/ERP.
Now, back to the show. Despite growing opposition from the Catholic Church and from rational skeptics, as well as from the authorities in Great Britain, who more and more sought to prosecute mediums for fraud or even try them as fortune tellers under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, belief in spiritualism saw a major resurgence during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. First, in 1904, a Boston Journal newspaper article claimed that human bones had been found in the cellar of the quote-unquote old spook house, the Fox Sisters' home in Hydesville, New York. The news was trumpeted across the globe. The Fox Sisters had actually told the truth, it was claimed. A false wall had supposedly fallen down in the cellar, revealing the grave of the murdered peddler Charles Rosma, whom the sisters claimed had been making the very first rapping sounds. Spiritualists would tout this as damning evidence for decades to come. Proof positive, they would claim, that the phenomena had always been real and that it was the Fox sisters' confessions that had been false. In truth, there has never been any record turned up to verify the existence of a peddler by the name of Rosma, and it is very telling that despite the publicity surrounding the discovery of these bones, authorities never took an interest in them or opened an investigation. Years later, in 1909, a doctor's report surfaced that indicated the bones had been identified as chicken bones. Nevertheless, the myth persisted, and in 1916 the entire cottage was moved to Lilydale, where it was kept as a museum. And lo and behold, all those years later, a tin chest was discovered in the house that was said to have belonged to the murdered peddler. Today we know that the bones were nothing but a hoax. There is no evidence of who the tin chest in Lilydale belonged to, and a modern investigation of the house's foundation showed there was no evidence of a false wall ever having been built in its cellar. But none of that mattered to most of the public, for by the time the doctor's report and the tin box had surfaced, the Great War had come with its terrible loss of life. Just as had been the case with the American Civil War, which helped to bolster belief in spirit communication, so too in the aftermath of World War I, a great surge in belief in the afterlife and communication with the dead occurred. And it was at this time that the greatest champion of spiritualism emerged, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author who had given the world Sherlock Holmes. By the end of World War I, when spiritualism was seeing its great resurgence, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's reputation was at its greatest height. He had published his first Sherlock Holmes story in 1887, and throughout the early 1890s, the popularity of his detective character soared, boosting the circulation of The Strand magazine, in which he regularly published Holmes stories. In 1893, in the story that introduced Holmes's nemesis Moriarty, Doyle killed off the detective, but fans would not accept it. In the first known instance of fan backlash, his readers, many of them young men, actually began wearing black in funerary grief over the death of their favorite character. They wrote angry letters to newspapers demanding the detective be resurrected, and they canceled their subscriptions to The Strand en masse, almost dragging the magazine under. The demand was such that Doyle eventually obliged, penning the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1901, a story set during the detective's heyday before his death. And then, within another couple years, he had officially retconned the detective's death. By that time, he had been knighted, not for his detective fiction, but for a work of history he'd written about the Boer War. And he was generally considered the most important man of letters in England, perhaps only second to Rudyard Kipling. Moreover, he came to be considered a sort of real-life Sherlock Holmes to the public. In 1903, a young British man named Adelgee, whose family had been harassed by poison pen letters since his youth, letters he had long been accused of writing himself, was imprisoned for supposedly slashing livestock and writing another series of letters taking credit for it. Irregularities in the case, surrounding questionable evidence, disregarded alibis, and Adelgee's poor eyesight, had led to a popular campaign to exonerate the young man. And in 1907, Doyle took up the case, examining crime scenes and questioning witnesses, just like his celebrated detective character, recording all his observations and conclusions in a series of articles that brought great publicity to the case. As a result, a committee of inquiry was commissioned, Adelgee was pardoned, and the furor led to the establishment of an official criminal court of appeal in England. Today, it's generally believed that Doyle got it wrong, that Adelgee was the writer of at least some of the poison pen letters, even if he was not guilty of the livestock mutilations, because his lawyers suppressed damning handwriting evidence in the form of other obscene letters Adelgee had written. Nevertheless, in the press, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle looked quite the hero, a real-life Sherlock Holmes, defending the wrongfully accused. And within a couple years, he had found another case of a man popularly believed to have been wrongly convicted, Oscar Slater, who had been falsely accused of murdering a woman during a robbery. Doyle was one among several journalists who continuously investigated the case, cast doubt on the prosecution's evidence, and wrote books advocating for Slater's pardon throughout the Great War and the 1920s, until Slater's final exoneration in 1928. It kept Doyle in the public eye, strengthening his reputation as a sharp investigator and a champion of justice for the wrongly accused. Therefore, toward the conclusion of the war, when spiritualism saw its greatest resurgence despite its skeptical detractors, Doyle's robust public support of the truth of spirit phenomena and defense of mediums everywhere did a great deal for the spiritualism movement. It is clear that Arthur Conan Doyle had believed in spiritualist phenomena for decades before his outspoken defense of it began in 1917. Some minor references to communication with spirits in his fiction make that clear, and he wrote an article confirming his belief in Light, the Journal of the London Spiritualist Alliance, way back in 1887. But for the next 30 years following the Fox sisters' confessions, he didn't offer much public support for it. Instead, he joined the Society for Psychical Research and participated in some of their investigations of mediumship. In fact, he liked to say that he celebrated 2 birthdays, commemorating both the day he was born and the day he joined the society. Like many others, Doyle suffered great losses in the war. His brother, his brothers-in-law, and his nephews were killed, and his son Kingsley died in hospital before Armistice Day. It is clear that his grief drove him from the cautious but hopeful investigation of psychical research to full-throated belief in communication with the dead. In 1915, a family friend who had been his wife's bridesmaid lost her brothers in the war, and afterward, while bedridden with a respiratory disease, she began to write messages from her brother, she claimed, channeling them through automatic writing. Doyle moved her into his home and thereafter sought similar communication with his late son. In 1919, at a spiritualist rally in Portsmouth, he became convinced that he had contacted Kingsley through the powers of a medium named Evan Powell. Thus, he became a true believer. When it came to psychic phenomena, or really any claims of the supernatural, Doyle erred on the side of belief, seeming to lose all rational perspective whenever the topic was brought up, and to rationalize some intellectual reason to credit the phenomena. Case in point, in 1920, The Strand commissioned him to write an article on fairies, and in it, he presented the notorious photographs of the Cottingley fairies, photos we now know were faked with cardboard cutouts, as genuine evidence that the creatures existed. Reaction was mixed, to say the least. Many saw right through the photos and thought it embarrassing that Doyle had been fooled by them. But Doyle insisted that his article should set the scientific world on its ear, opening their minds to the wonders of spiritualism. Quote, "The recognition of the fairies' existence will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud and will make it admit that there is a glamour and mystery to life. Having discovered this, the world will not find it so difficult to accept that spiritual message supported by physical facts which have already been put before it." End quote. That same year, while traveling in the United States and popping in on every séance and haunted house he could find, he wrote to another famous investigator of the phenomena, the stage magician Harry Houdini, and his letter reveals Doyle's irrational approach to investigating such claims. "I see that you know a great deal about the negative side of spiritualism," he wrote. "I hope more on the positive side will come your way. But it wants to be approached not in the spirit of a detective approaching a suspect, but in that of a humble religious soul yearning for help and comfort." Born Eric Weiss, Harry Houdini took his stage name from 2 of his idols, the magicians Harry Keller and Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, both of whom had been known to expose quote-unquote spirit phenomena as nothing more than the trickery of stage illusionists. Houdini's career was astonishing. He excelled at and was most famous for his escape acts, but his show featured sleight-of-hand card tricks and other illusions as well. In the first decade of the 20th century, he launched himself into global fame through savvy public relations, marketing himself as a daredevil more than a magician, staging high-profile escape stunts, publishing a magazine, and even producing films of his spectacular escapes. In 1920, the same year that he struck up a friendship with Doyle, he wrote a book called Miracle Mongers and Their Methods, exposing the tricks of, quote, fire eaters, heat resistors, poison eaters, venomous reptile defiers, sword swallowers, human ostriches, strong men, etc., end quote. On the strength of this expose, he was invited to join a committee organized by the magazine Scientific American to debunk those claiming to possess supernatural abilities. The magazine had offered cash to anyone who could prove such abilities, and with Houdini on the committee, no one ever could. Many claim that Houdini was driven to embark on his anti-spiritualism crusade because, after his mother died, he attended many a séance, genuinely hoping to contact her, and was never convinced. But this is a myth. As a boy, he had attended some séances, hoping to contact first his half-brother and then his father, and he had been a skeptic ever since, long before his mother's death. Doyle, who had forged a genuine friendship with Houdini, believed that he would be the one to sway his friend, and made it his mission to do so, bringing Houdini to every believable séance he could find. Almost invariably, Houdini managed to explain how the mediums produced their psychical phenomena, and at the ends of his own magic shows, he even began to lecture audiences about the charlatanry of mediums. Indeed, Houdini possessed a rare understanding of the tricks of mediumship because many involved escapology. Mediums often wowed their séance participants by producing spirit effects while tied to a chair and obscured behind a blanket in their quote-unquote cabinet, often a closet or a wooden armoire. Houdini recognized these contrivances as the illusion cabinets that stage magicians used, with false walls and hidden panels, used to make articles and people appear and disappear, and he understood well that the mediums were simply slipping their bonds within the cabinets. Doyle, for his part, never accepted Houdini's exposures, instead rationalizing that Houdini himself must be a skilled medium in order to reproduce the tricks of mediums. This was not the first time that he insisted someone had powers when they themselves assured him they did not. Doyle had even come to believe that his own wife possessed psychic abilities, even though she thought the notion was ridiculous. Perhaps more than anything, this insistence on belief in the phenomena, even in the face of definite evidence of its fraudulence, reveals Arthur Conan Doyle's advocacy of spiritualism as an article of faith rather than as something he might prove through close observation and clever deduction like Sherlock Holmes. A perfect example of the broad divide between the two friends, Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini, is their opposing response to the controversial French medium Eva Carrière, one of a new breed of physical mediums who produced what psychical researchers called quote-unquote ectoplasm. The term had been coined by Nobel Prize-winning French doctor Charles Richet decades earlier. Richet had taken an interest in mediumship but could not bring himself to subscribe to the, quote, spiritistic hypothesis, end quote, that the phenomena observed in seances were produced by the spirits of the dead. Instead, he believed they were psychic phenomena produced by mediums with the abilities of thought transference and telekinesis. He theorized that mediums were able to move and levitate objects and even manifest spirits through the projection of a material substance from their bodies, a fluidic material he called ectoplasm, based on a previous similar theory about psychic phenomena being produced by a mysterious, quote, actinic force, end quote. This notion was spread and passed through various iterations until it could be reconciled with the, quote-unquote, spiritistic hypothesis. Could not the manifestations and levitations performed through the hypothetical projection of ectoplasm be the means by which spirits interacted with the world through the bodies of mediums? It was simply a pseudoscientific explanation of the same phenomena, and it was originally thought to be invisible. However, when mediums themselves began to embrace the notion, suddenly it was quite visible, and in many a séance, participants began to see ectoplasm like a pasty membrane or a wrinkled gauzy fabric extruding from the orifices of mediums. These mediums demanded near complete darkness in their séances, claiming that if anyone illuminated the room while they were projecting the ectoplasm, or if they tried to seize it and examine it, it would surely kill the medium. In the darkness, the ectoplasm glowed. It creeped out of their mouths like a tentacle or limb, which came to be called a pseudopod, or it formed a phantom hand that might interact with objects, called a spirit glove. Finally, it even formed the face of a spirit and sometimes an entire full-body apparition. Eva Carrière was one such medium. Her real name was Martha Barraud, and she had been exposed for faking manifestations of a spirit in Algiers, using a cardboard cutout and a man she'd hired to wear a costume. She had changed her name to hide her past and had incorporated ectoplasm into her act. While many mediums used muslin or cheesecloth, often made to glow with phosphorescent paint, in Carrière's case, it was usually paper that she had chewed up and slowly spat out, unrolling it as it emerged. Sometimes she used magazine pages with faces printed on them to give the impression of a spirit manifestation. And her accomplice and lover, Julia Besson, would attach these ectoplasmic extrusions to wires so that they could be suspended into the air above the séance participants' heads, or would connect them to dummies to give the impression that her ectoplasm had manifested in apparition. Interestingly, one rather unique element of Carrière's séances is that she seems to have purposely manipulated the male sitters, including the researchers investigating her, through erotic interactions. She formed pornographic shapes with her ectoplasm. She conducted séances nude, and her partner even performed gynecological examinations of her in front of participants, ostensibly to prove she wasn't hiding fake ectoplasm inside her. It's unclear whether it was this erotic dimension of her séances that attracted Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or if it was his well-established gullibility when it came to spirit phenomena. But he believed Carrière was entirely genuine and faked nothing. Meanwhile, Houdini immediately dismissed her as a fraud. He saw her chewing and spitting out the paper ectoplasm and immediately recognized that she was manipulating the material with her tongue and forcing it to emerge exactly how she wanted it to, making it take the shape she desired and making the faces unfurl just so, likening it to an old illusion performed by South Asian street magicians, the quote, Hindu needle trick, end quote, in which the performer seems to swallow needles and thread and then regurgitates them strung together, a trick performed through the deft action of the tongue. In 1924, Houdini published a book, A Magician Among the Spirits, which offered a skeptical history of the foundation of the movement, specifically the Fox sisters and their eventual confession of fraudulence, as well as detailed debunkings of the most famous mediums, the Davenports, D.D. Hume, Eusebia Palladino, Henry Slade, and chapters dedicated to how specific tricks were accomplished, slate writing, spirit photography, and the strange phenomenon of ectoplasm, and critiques of the more credulous psychical investigations conducted by SPR researchers, including his friend, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In fact, he talks a great deal about Doyle in the book. In the introduction, he calls him, quote, a sincere and confirmed believer in spirit phenomena whose acquaintance I esteem, end quote. But he also reveals Doyle's stubborn insistence on belief even in the face of disproof throughout the book, showing that he continually defended mediums who had been irrefutably exposed as frauds. He even devotes an entire chapter to Doyle and reprints their correspondence in it. In this chapter, he reveals that Doyle's second wife, who had gone from not believing in spiritualism to becoming convinced by Doyle of her own clairvoyance and holding seances in their home, had gleaned information about Houdini's mother from his wife Bess and then pretended to be in contact with her. The two men's friendship did not survive the book's publication, and in response, Doyle 2 years later published his own exhaustive history and defense of spiritualism, The History of Spiritualism, in 2 volumes, in which he traces the roots of his faith to Swedenborg, presents Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer mentioned in Part 1, as a genuine prophet, and systematically denies the fraudulence of every famous medium exposed as a fraud, including the Fox sisters, asserting that the bones found in their basement years later, which recall were chicken bones, proved their confession was the real fraud. In it, he called Houdini, quote, the conjurer with his preposterous and ignorant theories of fraud, end quote, claiming he, quote, stuffed so many errors of fact into his book, A Magician Among the Spirits, and has shown such extraordinary bias on the whole question that his statement carries no weight, end quote. The same year that these statements were published, Houdini died from peritonitis, possibly brought on by some sudden, strong punches to the stomach delivered by a young man testing his claim that such blows did not hurt him. Before his death, he had apparently established a code with his wife Bess, and she began attending a long series of failed seances in which every medium failed to be able to produce the code that would prove true contact with Harry Houdini. In 1929, when Bess was delirious from a bout of the flu and from medication she was on after taking a fall, a medium named Arthur Ford managed to get her to sign a statement that he had cracked the code and proven his contact with Houdini. And this made Ford the toast of the spiritualist community, a star at Lilydale and other medium retreats. But it was eventually revealed to be a hoax. The code had been published previously, and there's evidence that he cajoled it out of Bess and then pressured her to sign the statement that he'd succeeded. Meanwhile, Arthur Conan Doyle descended into a sort of folie à deux with Lady Doyle, who began claiming to channel a spirit called Phineas that guided Doyle in a series of quasi-religious pronouncements that he must abstain from eating meat, revere the spirit of Christ but reject dogmatism, and thereby elevate his spirit. In the last year of his life, he had a final public falling out with the Society for Psychical Research, whose skeptical approach to the investigation of mediumship he called a, quote, tradition of obtuse negation, end quote, claiming the SPR had, quote, for a whole generation produced no constructive work of any kind, but has confined its energies to the misrepresentation and hindrance of those who have really worked at the most important problem ever presented to mankind, end quote. That year, he led a mass resignation from the organization. As his health failed, he wrote once more in a letter about his friend Houdini, looking forward to meeting him in the afterlife and telling him, I told you so. Quote, there's just a chance that I may talk it all over with Houdini himself before so very long. I view the prospect with perfect equanimity. That is one thing that psychic knowledge does. It removes all fears of the future, end quote. At his memorial service later that year, a grand event at Royal Albert Hall that served as a spiritualist mass meeting, one medium claimed that Doyle was in attendance, his ghost seated in an empty chair beside his widow. The year after Doyle's death, one prominent exposer of the frauds of mediums, Harry Price, who had been a particular target of Doyle's ire for years, investigated a popular medium named Helen Duncan. A materialization medium, Duncan regularly claimed to produce ectoplasm and manifest full-body apparitions. Photographs as early as 1928 had revealed that the spirit connected to the end of the tendril of ectoplasm extruding from her mouth was clearly just a crude papier-mâché doll on a coat hanger, draped with a sheet, or even sometimes just a rubber glove. A sample of her ectoplasm was determined to be nothing more than cheesecloth. Believing that she swallowed the material and regurgitated it, a common vaudeville routine called controlled regurgitation, Price surprised her in his laboratory with an X-ray machine, and when she realized she was caught, she made a great scene, screaming, striking her husband, and running from the lab into the street. Afterward, when she finally consented to the X-ray and nothing was found, the investigators demanded that her husband empty his pockets, believing she had surreptitiously passed him the material, and he refused, further convincing the researchers that he was an accomplice to her imposture. In a later seance, Duncan allowed a further sample of her ectoplasm to be taken. Though this material was not cheesecloth, it was shown to be chewed-up paper soaked in egg whites. Like many another medium, Helen Duncan continued to operate despite her fraud having been exposed. In 1933, after one of her doll manifestations was grabbed and kept as evidence, she was arrested in Edinburgh and convicted of fraud. But later in the 40s, during the Second World War, she was back at it. In 1941, she claimed to be in contact with the spirit of a sailor who had died in the sinking of a ship, whose loss had not yet been made public knowledge. But when it was discovered that she had simply picked up the gossip of the ship's sinking from the families of lost sailors who had already been notified, she was prosecuted again, but this time under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. The trial was a sensation. Winston Churchill called it, quote, absolute tomfoolery, end quote. Her conviction stands as the end of an era, proving that mediums could be successfully imprisoned on the charge of simply claiming to commune with spirits. In 1951, the UK law was updated with the passage of the Fraudulent Mediums Act, prohibiting any psychic or medium to make money by deception, and essentially killing spiritualism in England. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, here in the US, mediumship, fortune-telling, and claims of psychic abilities remain a protected form of speech and religious practice under the First Amendment. Scientific American's public challenge remained open, and its prize was even increased to $15,000 by 1941, but proof of communication with spirits has never been convincingly provided. After World War II, rather than a resurgence as was seen after the Civil War and the First World War, spiritualist belief underwent a transformation, coming to focus more on healing than direct communication with the dead, and the spiritualist church movement merged with the spiritual communication of Pentecostalism. So too, the field of psychical research changed. A young man by the name of J.B. Rhine, who had been inspired by Arthur Conan Doyle's claims about spiritualism, became the founding father of parapsychology, focusing more on ESP research and thereby diverting much attention away from what came to be seen as more old-fashioned mediumship. Mediums continued to claim they were channeling spirits, though, and much like Arthur Conan Doyle publishing the pronouncements of Phineas as channeled by his wife, a number of books were published claiming to be the communication of spirits, many of which were not even supposed to be human spirits, such as the quote-unquote energy personality essence, Seth, who claimed to reveal hidden truths to his channeler Jane Roberts in the 60s, and the collective consciousness Abraham, who made further revelations to Esther Hicks, a fan of Jane Roberts, in the 80s. Then there was Ramtha, a supposed Lemurian warrior who was channeled by J.Z. Knight, and the extraterrestrial intelligence Ra, channeled by Carla Ruckert. Eventually, this New Age channeling too subsided, and these days the fraudulence of spiritualism principally survives in grief vampires, like John Edward, Teresa Caputo, Thomas John, Matt Fraser, and Tyler Henry, self-proclaimed psychic mediums who make their living as TV personalities and have been exposed over and over by professional mentalists as nothing more than frauds who use the techniques of cold reading to fool people into thinking they speak with the dead. Even though spiritualism was exposed over and over, from the Fox sisters to Helen Duncan, as nothing more than a fraud, it continues to this day. The Lilydale Assembly remains in operation. Visit its website and you can browse all its events, like healing circles, thought exchange seminars, trance workshops, astral projection tutorials, ghost walks, and classes on clairvoyance, clairsentience, and sensing auras. All it costs is a gate fee and the cost of admission to every event and workshop you want to attend, as well as the price of any private readings, plus gas and accommodations. So as it has been from the beginning, spiritualist belief and mediumship continues to be more of a business than a religion. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I'd like to hear from you patrons how you've been enjoying these recent series. I've been taking something of a break from more politically relevant topics and returned to my longtime interests in hoaxes and misinformation, mostly as an act of self-care. Would you like to hear more of this, or would you rather hear me return to some more political topics? The 10-year anniversary of the podcast approaches, and I'd love your input in planning my upcoming topics. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel and by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, consider that while belief in the human soul and its persistence beyond death is appealing, there has never been any reliable scientific evidence of it. Mediums are frauds. Near-death experiences can be explained physiologically, and the simple fact that cognitive decline, physical trauma, and chemical alteration so dramatically affect personality, memory, and selfhood is the strongest evidence we have that human consciousness is reliant on a living brain.
Evening. Buyer's remorse. Buy a new car? I'll be moving in. Let's get started.
Sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I bought it from Carvana.
You what?
Yeah, great price. I even have 7 days to love it or return it.
So there's no...
No buyer's remorse. More like buyer's rejoice.
I guess I'll let myself out. Congratulations. I mean it.
Buyer's rejoice. Buy your car today on Carvana.
Limitations and exclusions may apply. See our 7-day return policy at Carvana.com.
Your team just added its 67th AI tool and also your 67th security blind spot. The good news? The Vanta agent works like a GRC engineer in the background, finding every app your team uses, scoring the risk, and drafting fixes for you. Vanta is the platform used by over 16,000 fast-moving companies like Ramp, Cursor, and Harvey, who are shaping the future with AI and staying ahead of AI risk. Get started at Vanta.com.